Hello, this is Halisa Aylwine, and this is our second little Passover snack. Make that video snack. Just a short little teaching out of the new Creation Gospel Workbook, which is Creation Gospel Workbook 6, the Hebrew Traditions in Prayer and Worship. And it is available now on Amazon, and it'll soon be available at Hebraic Roots Network. And what I decided to do is just give you some little snacks out of the workbook to give you an overview or an idea of some of the details that are in there. And as we said in the first little video, the workbook itself is a more in-depth look of Standing with Israel, a house of prayer for all nations, because it's centered around the Hebrew prayers, traditions, and so forth. And in this third section, we're looking at Passover-related types of Hebrew traditions. And in the Passover, everybody usually gets together, whether with family, congregation, fellowship, and they try to do a Passover Seder. And frequently that is a point of contention rather than a point of unity, because everyone has different ideas about what they should be doing at the Seder. Are we trying to make the Seder look exactly like Yeshua's Seder would have been? And so all sorts of questions tend to come up. For instance, questions about should the egg be on the plate, and we'll try to deal with that. What about that foot washing thing? Maybe we can do a little snack video on that one. But in the first video, we talked about the song Dayenu. Even though it's a traditional song, obviously it's not in the scripture itself. But would Yeshua and the disciples have sung the song Dayenu? And the conclusion was most likely. There's some things that are missing from the song that lead us to believe it's a very old song associated with Passover. Another question that tends to come up that's in the traditional or the Orthodox Jewish Haggadah is whether Yeshua and his disciples would have had charoset, which is that sweet mixture of apples and honey and nuts and cinnamon and so forth. And you put it on the matzah with some horseradish or whatever your maror, your bitter herb might be. And then you put the charoset on there as something a little sweet. So as you're eating, you might start off with something bitter, but then you end up with something sweet. You say, where is that in the Torah? I don't see that in the Torah. All I see is matzah and maror, or the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs. And these were given. These would have been at every Passover Seder, matzah and maror, the bitter herbs. But what about this charoset thing? Is it necessary to put this on the Seder plate? Is it necessary to eat this Hallel sandwich, as it's been called? So we want to go back into history, and the place that we look is in a book called the Mishnah, which is a historical Jewish record of Jewish law. And the interesting thing about it is it even records opinions that are not valid. It's kind of like the Supreme Court that way. It'll record both the prevailing decision as well as other ideas about that particular case. So when you're reading the Mishnah, you kind of have to know how to read it. But it's going to be probably the closest historical record we have to the first century of how Jews would have observed the Passover. So there's two things from Yeshua's Passover. One is more evident because it's stated. It talks about the disciples reclining, and that is very much a part of the Jewish tradition, because it says in Mishnah Pesachim 10:1 that even a poor person in Israel should not eat until he reclines. In other words, is it just traditional to recline at a Seder? Yes, in some respects. But was it something in custom that the disciples and Yeshua did? Yes, it was part of the custom that they incorporated into their meal. The other question again was the charoset. Dipping in the dish, could that have been the salt water and the other bitter herb? Sure, it could have been. But specifically this sweet mixture of charoset, well, most likely the answer is yes. They probably did dip in charoset at the meal, even though it's not specifically stated in the Torah, just like reclining is not stated in the Torah. It was a part of those first century traditions. And we find this in Mishnah Pesachim 10:3. And It talks about being served the lettuce. A lot of times on our plates we'll see romaine lettuce because it can turn kind of bitter. It says before he has the bread, the unleavened bread, and then it says they served him unleavened bread and lettuce and chroset. But then it follows with, even though the chroset is not a mitzvah. In other words, they're saying, yes, we incorporate chroset into the meal, but it's not part of the commandment. In other words, when we eat unleavened bread and we eat the bitter herbs, we know we're fulfilling a commandment. The chroset, yes, we're eating at the meal because it has a symbolic value there of not just the sweetness of deliverance, but also, and we can do this in another snack video, how it represents the mortar of the bricks in Egypt and so forth. So the chroset was not considered part of keeping the commandment, it was just considered part of the symbolism of the meal. And then in addition to that, it says in the temple, serve him the carcass of the Passover offering. So what are we saying? Did they recline? Yes. That's a traditional thing that they did. Did they have chroset? Most likely they did, because again, that was part of the tradition. But did they have the required things? Did they have matzah? Did they have maror, the bitter herbs? And did they have their Passover offering? The answer there would be a qualified yes, because if this is literally the Passover Seder, and there again, that might be snack worthy of another video. Was this literally the Passover Seder, or was it held the night before so that he could be sacrificed as the Passover? If this were a Passover, a literal Passover Seder, yes, they would have been eating the carcass of the Passover offering, which history tells us that it would typically feed around 50 people. And we know that with Yeshua's group, there were probably around 13. But there may have also been people there serving. There may have been extra people there at the Seder. So yes, they had the exact elements that the Torah prescribes, but then they often had other meals, arichat, that they might have, because remember, you can eat the Passover for 7 days, it says. You can't eat the Passover carcass for 7 days. That has to be eaten before midnight. But yes, you can eat the Passover for 7 days. That's part of the commandment. So, did they have a Passover carcass? The text doesn't tell us. But most likely, yes, at the Seder, they reclined. They had matzah. They had maror. They probably had chroset. And if they had a Paschal offering, then they would have eaten that too. And that's our snack.